Mr. Chomsky, since Kofi Annan's term will be expired within less than 6 months, how do you evaluate his years? And what was the, if there is, what was the great achievement he could make, and what was the failure or misjudgment he made? And you mentioned about what we call the high-level panel report in your book. Is there any way this organization could be revitalized in the era which, major countries doesn't care about the rule of law or international law?
The high-level report from, I think it was December 2004, was a very sensible document, in my opinion. It included leading Western figures like Gareth Evans, Brent Scowcroft, and others, and a sampling from the rest of the world. And their proposals, I thought, were pretty sensible, particularly their proposal, their conclusion that Article 51 of the Charter should not be revised or rewritten, that it stands appropriately today and it should remain the core of international law. Well, the consequences of that they didn't have to spell out, but you know them. Yeah, I think that was a proper decision. That's the core of their proposals. As to your question, there's no way of for the UN to function if the great powers simply kick it in the face, which they do. I mean, just take a look at the record of vetoes. I mean, the question of violating Security Council resolutions was brought up before, and they shouldn't be violated. But the most extreme form of violation of a Security Council resolution is to veto it. I mean, you can't, that's the ultimate extreme of violating a Security Council resolution. Well, take a look at the record of vetoes. I mean, in the early years of the United Nations, when the U.S. ran it almost totally just for obvious economic and military reasons, the UN was very popular in the United States. And there was huge denunciation of the Russians for vetoing things. You even had distinguished anthropologists giving psychoanalytic explanations of why the Russians say no all the time, because they were raised in swaddling clothes and that sort of thing. So it was this terrible thing, the Russians are vetoing resolutions. Well, through the 1950s, the UN became, to a limited extent, more representative of the peoples of the world, with decolonization, with the recovery of other industrial societies. By the 1960s, it was not completely under control. So take a look at the record of vetoes since the 1960s. The U.S. is far in the lead on a whole range of issues. Britain is second, and nobody else is even close. Okay, well, as long as that's the case, can't do much. The UN can't do very much, including the Secretary General. He's had some good positions and statements. You can't implement them if the great powers, that's primarily the United States and Britain, which Britain's leading Journal of International Affairs, Journal of the Royal Institute, described Blair's Britain as the spear carrier for Pax Americana, which is not inaccurate, as long as the one great superpower and its spear carrier dismiss the United Nations and international law, then there's nothing much that the UN can do. And that's, again, a problem that is internal to the great powers. If you take a look at U.S. public opinion, it is overwhelmingly in support of giving a greater, and in fact leading role to the United Nations international affairs. So an overwhelming majority of Americans think that the UN should take the lead, not the United States, in international conflicts and crises. Since April 2003, I think around 2/3 of the American public has been in favor of keeping U.S. troops in Iraq only under UN supervision. That's essentially what the Italian voters voted, Spanish voters voted for in March 2004. There's even, surprisingly, a small majority that thinks the U.S. should give up the veto and follow the will of the United Nations, even if they don't like the policies. There's strong majorities in favor of increasing funding for UN peacekeeping operations and so on. So if, again, like the global warming question, if public opinion entered into the formation of public policy, well, then the UN would have a much wider latitude to function. If public policy remains divorced from public opinion, that won't be true. If it remains in the hands of concentrations of power that are essentially unaccountable, no, then the UN will be very restricted. I mean, after all, the Bush administration went out of its way to humiliate the United Nations by appointing as its ambassador someone who says, very outspoken, says the United Nations does not exist. If it's an instrument, if it follows the will of the United States, it's fine. Otherwise, we ignore it because international law doesn't apply to us. It's a contract made among states. If one of the states decides not to follow it, that's fine. Of course, it doesn't mean if some enemy decides not to follow it, it's fine. It means if we decide not to follow it, it's fine. Well, appointing him as ambassador is a message, a very clear message to the United Nations, not very subtle, and so are the actions. In fact, in the build-up to the Iraq War, the formal Iraq War, we now know that it was already going on. Britain and the United States were already carrying it on in secret, but in the so-called build-up to it in the fall of 2002, Colin Powell and others pointed out to the United Nations that you can either accept the U.S. position or you can become a debating society. Approximately that message. Well, if that's the position of the dominant great power in violation of the will of its own population, then there's a limited range of options open to the United Nations. And that's a problem right here in the United States, secondarily in England, and in fact elsewhere in the world too, but responsibility is distributed roughly relative to power.